Thank you so much, Liam, and thank you to Richard and the Center for Early Modern Studies. I'm thrilled to be here today, and also to my co-presenters. I'm seeing links actually between all of our work, which is really exciting. I'm moving us in terms of time into the 1790s and into the early 19th centuries, a little out of the early modern period, but in that kind of transitional space. In a moment, I'm going to ask Liam to actually share my slideshow. I'm having trouble doing that myself on Microsoft Teams, but I'll just go ahead and get started. So my work today examines the efforts of Catholic nuns to reestablish their schools and presence as educators in England after their arrival as refugees during the French Revolution. And in 1794, as an example of this, the Bruges Augustinians opened their doors to students. This was a mere month after settling into Hengrave Hall in Suffolk. And if you want to advance to the second slide, Liam, the Dunkirk Benedictines took residence in the former Mary Ward Sisters Hammersmith Convent. We have a picture of that here. And they were enrolling students within the next year after they arrived in 1795. I find that very stunning. And so, in fact, we find that nuns pretty quickly entered the competitive market for children's schooling in England in the 1790s. They were recruiting students, obviously, and advancing a variety of curricular options. And by the end of the century, their educational and religious endeavors had sparked national concerns amongst politicians about their potential recruitment of both working class and Protestant students, as well as young women, into the novitiate. In addition, popular journalism raised questions about the impact of Catholic schools upon existing English Protestant establishments. The profession of teaching had been overcrowded since the 1780s, and the arrival of refugees from the continent that were bringing in these very skill sets really exacerbated this. And I want to also bring attention to the fact that there were thousands of French immigrant priests who were also entering into teaching. We see in the St. James Chronicle, 22nd of September, 1792, this comment, quote, "We shall now have the swarm of seminaries in the neighborhood of London, cheaply and promptly supplied with teachers," end quote. This was more likely directed at the French emigrants, but it does show the sort of temperature of the time. So how did nuns within this environment establish schools and student bodies? So to approach this question, I want to consider the demands that teaching and boarding students put upon individuals and communities. Beyond the challenges of the work itself, how did nuns leverage their positions within local communities to recruit and widen their social networks? How were their efforts perceived? And finally, what was the national response to their endeavors? This is an emerging field. Scholarship on the Irish and British exiled orders has focused primarily on the early modern period and tends to sort of drop off around the time of the French Revolution and the return of most of the nuns to England. And if you want to advance to the next slide, this is just a screenshot of a table looking at the different orders and when they came back. And we have before 1800 22 groups returning to England. The resettlement period is less understood. First of all, there's less information during this transitional time. Nuns were channeling their efforts into physical and economic survival as a community. They were also updating various community documents, some of which had not been kept up during the revolution. We also know that not all of the groups decided to teach. And so why did others move more quickly into that? I don't have the answer to all of those questions, but those were some of the things that I was looking at. Before I examine a bit more closely what is known about these schools, I want to turn briefly to what has already been talked about, which is the schools that were on the continent from the exiled orders. Some of these remained open even in the early years of the revolution, and some groups even were bringing students with them as they migrated back to England. Historians such as Claire Walker, Caroline Bowden, as well as my co-presenters today, they've discussed convents as centers of learning for both community members and students. The libraries and archives that nuns developed and expanded reveal the great value that they put upon reading, writing, and the preservation of knowledge. As Caroline Bowden argues, the English convent schools provided a highly individualized model of education, allowing parents to coordinate on their terms their daughter's schooling. We know that some of these groups had extensive curriculum, and Cormac talked about the sepulchrines and the different subjects that were taught there. Others functioned a bit more as finishing schools, such as we see with the Paris Conceptionists, and who would board students for as short as one term. Girls attending convent schools abroad benefited from the wide culture of the European cities that their expatriate education provided. Gabriel Glickman suggests that an education spent in exile fostered transnational awareness in English children. It functioned as a rite of separation from parents into the broader Catholic community. This rite would no longer be necessary, at least not in the same way, after educators migrate to England. And this is, of course, where we see a variety of schooling options becoming available. We want to remember, too, that the nuns had competition among their fellow co-religionists. I'm thinking here of Abby Caron's work in Somerstown, his highly successful school that catered to both boys and girls. And there were many joint adventures between French priests and Protestant and Catholic community members. And so the nuns were just one more kind of, group in the mix. But let's begin with the first consideration. What demands did teaching put upon the nuns and their communities? Beyond the fact that having a school increased the nuns' visibility on a local level, nuns themselves were needed to manage and teach the children. The Cambrai Benedictines community history, in a great tradition, suggests that the nuns did not relish the idea of teaching school children after their harrowing travails abroad. And the quote here is, "They obediently bent themselves to the highly uncongenial task of educating young ladies," end quote. The trauma of the revolution and geographical displacement had put a strain upon the bodies within the group. Some aged or infirm members had suffered throughout the period, some had passed away, and those who were ill or elderly were to be cared for by the able-bodied nuns. So we have to think about those differing physical demands that were put upon individual nuns and communities. Some staffing relief could be found through the hiring of lay teachers, the Cambrai Benedictines, to return to them. And if you'll advance the image to the next slide, shows Salford Hall, which was the second location that the Cambrai Benedictines were in. And they, even before this time, had hired Protestant teachers and supervisors to fill in some gaps in staffing. It's likely that those few employment positions for teachers helped to further positive relationships between nuns and surrounding communities. And I wanted to show this image because it shows one of the difficulties for the nuns in England, which was that they were not able to be fully enclosed. And we see here nuns within the space of their own property, but with the school children. There's a smaller child on the right with some nuns, and then there's some there's some older girls on the left, and possibly some lay Catholic women who are walking down the center. And so thinking again about those kinds of interactions that they were having. Perceptions about the nuns in local communities led to new physical constraints or interactions. And what do I mean by that? Well, I already stated it was difficult to keep enclosure given the various kinds of residences they were in. But in another example, the French Benedictines who first came to London, they were from Moutray, they opened a school in London as early as 1792 with their first pupil, Fanny Fallon. Public sentiment, mixed as it was, induced the young Fallon to answer callers because, quote, "some people look at the sisters and say rude things," end quote. So they're actually having the student answer versus the nuns themselves. So this kind of meant that the nuns had to sort of regulate what was going on. Local interest in the Bruges Augustinians at Hengrave Hall, and this is the last image I have on the slideshow, made many of them lament that they could not maintain enclosure and remove themselves from the public eye. This is a quotation from one of the sisters. "We were never an hour secure of being alone, for all sorts of persons flocked to see us as they would have done to see some foreign Christians," end quote. And the nun acknowledges that all were very civil and very generous to them generally. So those are some things we could think about, and then moving on to how nuns leveraged those various attitudes of the wider community. We have some idea about this when we look at how they advertised for their schools. And I think at this point we can close the PowerPoint. I've showed the images and I'll just carry on. So for example, one of the ads that I looked at was published by the prioress of the French Benedictines in 1794, and it drew upon several key themes crucial to establishing a student body. One was the nuns' reputation abroad, their need for funding, and their appropriate curriculum for girls. Their advertisement states, quote, "Their reputation for instruction is so well established, not only in France, but with many families in England, that it needs no further eulogium," end quote. Second, their economic need is evident in the ad. This is another quote: "The present history of the ladies of Moutray cannot be unknown to anyone the least conversant with public affairs," end quote. So it's sort of framing themselves as victims of the revolution. They're setting themselves up as having an economic need. In another advertisement, the Cambrai Benedictines, advertising for their Woolton School, state that they are supplying education of Catholic young ladies by the English nuns, lately escaped from Compiègne, formerly of Cambrai. So they're this framing establishes their credibility as Catholic educators, as English, and as anti-revolutionists. This was important because there were politicians framing nuns as potential Jacobin disruptors, which seems sort of strange. So drawing upon various political and national identities, these ads seek to establish common ground with readers and appeal to Catholic audiences. So the social networks of nuns were thus very important in garnering students. Catholic families might patronize particular convents by enrolling multiple children in one school. For example, 5 of Lady Frances Jerningham's granddaughters were attending the school run by the French Benedictines by 1806, and Sir Thomas Gage had 4 grandchildren enrolled at the convent school at Hengrave Hall, run by the Bruges Augustinians. So we turn then for a moment to curriculum. The French Benedictines 1794 advertisement proposes to instruct, quote, "young ladies in every branch of useful knowledge, becoming the delicacy of their sex," end quote. Though varying from house to house, curricula in nun schools generally challenge students to develop individual talents in subjects such as writing, language, music, and the arts, as well as to work collaboratively and demonstrate knowledge in religion, geography, and history. Courses in convent schools ranged from traditional offerings for girls to more innovative subjects, including student-directed theatricals. In 1814, at the English Dame School at Winchester, Dame Agnes Whelan personally assembled, quote, "a library of well-chosen books," end quote, and revising the curriculum to emphasize a solid course of reading. The French Benedictines took a more traditional approach, teaching girls proper behavior, religion, and rigorous self-application to their studies. Subjects such as French, English, needlework, and drawing accompanied singing and performing suitable tragedies, including those based on biblical stories. In fact, the Benedictines ran a highly successful school, teaching around 166 French, Irish, and English Catholic girls between 1793 and 1811. I think it's important to recognize, sort of as a side note, that Protestant schooling in England was incredibly variable, ranging from instruction at home or in small cohorts under the direction of a teacher or governess, to residential programs in various sized boarding schools, which were often criticized as being too regimented and too unregulated. Charity or dame schools served children from the working classes with the curriculum focused more on religious conversion and preparation for professions than on academic rigor. And so there is more work to be done in looking at nuns' charity schools that they were developing alongside some of these Protestant models. And I'll say more about those charity schools in a moment. It is difficult to know if opening a school bettered or worsened relationships with locals. So Dom Aiden Bellinger has argued that, quote, a girls' school was more socially acceptable than a convent of enclosed nuns, end quote. However, convent schools were and always had been potential portals into the novitiate. This is a point amplified, as you can imagine, in anti-Catholic propaganda. The Catholic Relief Acts of 1788 and 1791 had not lifted the restrictions outlawing the Catholic education of children with Protestant fathers. And there are a few examples of Protestant children enrolled in these schools during the 1790s. We know, for example, in 1800, the French Benedictines boarded 2 Protestant Swinburne sisters. Although the community turned away an Irish Protestant prospect, that was controversial. Lady Frances Jerningham, who's part of the Catholic elite and is involved in their affairs, thought this was a double standard. But that same year, they also turned away another Protestant applicant, explaining that they did not admit Protestants, particularly if they wanted to convert to Catholicism. And this was really the crux of the matter. So these seeming inconsistencies may have been motivated by the perception that their community's stability was put at risk. And this would become, in 1800, with the introduction of the Monastic Institutions Bill, became a real worry. And Catholic nuns in England did recruit novices. The French Benedictines brought in 1 novice in 94 and another in 96. In the 12 years that the Benedictines of Cambrai were in Woolton, they recruited 7 new members, 4 of whom had been students. A notable recruit, a Miss Crilly, who managed the Woolton School in the first years of the Benedictine stewardship. She had been a teacher, left to pursue another venture, and then came back later, joined the community, and became Sister Teresa Mary Clare Crilly, professed in 1799, and she led the school for years afterwards. We have other examples. If you looked at the numbers that Cormac provided, we can see that the Sepulcrans were also recruiting novices. And we have Miss Weld, who was professed in full ritual in the Franciscan community in Winchester in 1795, and several professions amongst the Louvain Augustinians who were in Amesbury, Wiltshire. This, of course, called unwanted attention to the women refugees. 4 women had been professed amongst the Bruges Augustinians at Hingrave Hall before 1800, and 3 more were in the novitiate. So within the context of this highly politicized environment, the nuns must have been uneasy about the visibility, potential viability of their schools and their convents, but it wasn't slowing them down. We turned into the national response to refugee nuns, particularly in regards to their work with children. It's important to point out that there were lots of debates about the presence of the nuns. One of the big ones was sorting out, well, what do we do with French versus English nuns? I don't have time to get into that today, but I'm going to focus really on the debates around their schools. So the bill was an attempt to regulate nuns' activities in England, and when we're looking at the schools, one of the larger arguments is the concerns around recruiting Protestant children and working class. And within the parliamentary discussions, we see the main issue emerging, which was control of curricula, concern around conversion. And the opponents of the bill argued that the schools that were run by dissenters did not have any form of regulation. So why did it make sense to regulate the Catholic schools? Opponents of the bill thus diverted attention from the nun schools to the potential disruption, to the disruptive potential of liberal Protestant schooling. And thinking here about those private schools run by dissenters, particularly those following a rationalist approach really put forward by Joseph Priestley, there was the concern that they were inculcating atheism and radical political thought, possibly spurring a future revolution in England. So there comes this sort of concern around what is being taught in these Catholic schools, some which are being run by French, and are there revolutionary ideas there, or is the real concern amongst those who were here at home? In addition, opponents of the bill lauded the benefits for Catholic families who now had the option of educating their children in England rather than sending them abroad, which was technically a penal offense. So the Monastic Institutions Bill, as I mentioned, was also very concerned about the recruitment of working class children. Repatriated nuns, such as the English Benedictines at Winchester, who were from Brussels, and the English Poor Clares at Haggerston from Rouen, as well as French priests, established charity schools for children in financial need. By offering schooling to both paying and non-paying students, nuns and priests were serving a larger local community while at the same time keeping their doors open. The establishment of charity schools fueled further anti-Catholic sentiment. One critic complained that French priests and nuns were offering not only free education, but also clothing and food to the poor. And we see in the Bath Journal an interesting discussion, a protest against the encroachment of Catholic institutions in Britain. Quote, "Are not languages, painting, drawing, music, and other employments usurped by foreigners to the ruin of our own countrymen? Surely this is another Norman conquest by insidious attack." So there was the sense that refugees from France could not help but import semi-Jacobin schemes to educate the working classes. And the Monastic Institutions Bill was essentially offering a condition to Catholic religious. If it passed, the government would protect current religious as long as they did not recruit new members, quote, "in useless inactivity and seclusion," unquote, and did not seduce the children of Protestant parents. So fortunately for the nuns, the bill was dismissed in the House of Lords, and nuns were left to navigate the uncertain political terrain ahead. More research is necessary to examine how nuns maintained and grew their schools during the years leading to the legalization of Catholicism in England mid-century. And Catholic emancipation in 1829 did not alter nuns' legal status, although it did provide an indication of the direction that England was going. However, as I hope I've begun to explicate today, women religious skillfully leveraged their positions in the tumultuous environment of the 1790s and beyond, advancing Catholic cultures of learning in England. Thank you.